In today's society, being tasked with the study of philosophy in a university setting is weary to the philosophy student who is actually dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. The same can be said for the arts in general. Nowadays, art students are steeped with so much rubbish that it is very difficult to make any headway in the pursuit of knowledge. Not only that, but the narrative which professors in the arts are nowadays compelled and sometimes, unfortunately, even coerced to teach are saturated with the flawed ideals of capitalism, post-Marxism, and neoliberalism. Safe spaces and other ideological measures have been put into place by the administrative levels at universities as a means to control the cultivation of minds so as to make them suitable for contemporary academia and doing well in the context of a capitalist society. Most students cannot and do not want to get beyond regurgitating what they remember being taught in one class or another. In a different context, such as a letter written to a parent, the material produced for an arts essay would often be seen as indicative of insanity, but it seems sane to produce material that one is rewarded for producing. The extent of the attack being mounted on education should be noted, because in a genuinely educational setting, there would be no control measures put in place by the instructor or the administrative level of the university when it came to interpretation of the presented content, and the learner would be free to apply his or her own logic in its analysis and applying the knowledge they had been able to acquire so far. One could justifiably argue that many subject areas in the liberal arts, such as queer theory and gender studies, ought to be abandoned entirely, at least insofar as they exist presently, as only subversive to applying academic discipline and logic. To break away from this, the training regimen of the liberal arts, if one should so desire, one simply has to proceed as one would in a non-academic context, dealing with issues in a rational and common-sense way. To rise above the janitorial level, which is generally superior to that of the academy, one, of course, needs to learn and study logic, practical methods of conceptual analysis, and the methods of one's discipline. The ambitious student dedicated to pursuing knowledge ought to read the best work and to write extensively, because our capacity to think without writing is limited. It is not surprising that in the context of controlled learning of universities where education has now been sabotaged, the amount of writing we are encouraged to do as practice has become very limited. Nowadays, many art students produce material which springs from urges other than the urge to represent reality accurately, which should be the goal in pursuing knowledge, and in many cases this material is grossly at odds with the evidence and/or is confused. Indeed, even the concept of truth itself has been challenged extensively by contemporary philosophers, even often not thought of as to represent reality with accuracy, even in the muddled context of metaphysics and epistemology, the study of knowledge, due to the pragmatist influence. If a person says in all seriousness that a chair is a cat, then this would be taken as a sign of insanity. However, if in following the esteemed utilitarian John Stuart Mill, a person says in all seriousness that happiness is a concrete whole that has money as one of its essential parts, this would not be taken as a sign of insanity in the context of the university, even though it is equally wrong-headed, if not more so. Common sense would simply dictate that happiness is an emotion, and a desirable one at that. As was the case before the birth of analytic philosophy, philosophy is now plagued by the cult of great minds, namely esteemed continental philosophers who often serve as political agents and propagandists. It is also plagued by the bureaucracy of the university insofar as the matters of compelled academic teachings go. The techniques being employed here are the same as in religion. More than ever, I go out of my way to stress that in too many classes, one could get more wisdom from, talking to a janitor than from the text we are currently reading in any given class. This can be argued for in many ways relating to the paramount gap between the work of contemporary metaphysicians and simple common-sense thinking approaches to answering the same kind of questions, like, what kind of substances are there? Where common sense would presuppose that by substances we are talking about material things, and so the custodian might reply, well, there are solids, liquids, and gases. Such a response is more accurate to reality than to make arguments about the mind or the soul being a kind of substance, wherein the meaning of the term substance is now being used in an inconsistent way. People, and especially naive art students, very much want to believe that they are being exposed to very valuable material, and it is easy to convince those students who choose to take philosophy that they are benefiting merely by being exposed to the much revered texts, One can make a comparison here with exposure to the Latin Mass of people who know no Latin. Learning the history of William James is important, as he provided the cultural model and the accompanying ideology for the United States, but many of the pragmatists are just not worth reading. Their thinking is of such low quality, and at the same time it is very difficult to penetrate. Likewise are the works of any continental philosopher. Consistently they reduce to mere nonsense when a proper logical analysis is applied to what they are saying. Take, for instance, the continental philosopher Jacques Derrida's famous proclamation that true forgiveness is forgiving the unforgivable. When analyzed, we first notice that forgiveness itself is not an entity capable of performing any action. So out of generosity we may interpret that by true forgiveness he simply means truly forgiving people, and then we are left with truly forgiving people forgive the unforgivable. This still doesn't make sense, because if something is unforgivable, that means that it cannot be forgiven by definition. But we know that there are people who can be described as truly forgiving, so we may choose to soldier on with another very generous interpretation that by the unforgivable, Derrida simply means that things, which are very hard to forgive. What we are left with then is a far less provocative statement, which is quite devoid of any real intellectual insight. Namely, truly forgiving people forgive things which are very hard to forgive. To which we might also add that forgiving people more commonly forgive transgressions which are more forgivable. The point of this is to illustrate that although Derrida is a renowned philosopher and his utterances sound very profound, it does no actual philosophical work in bettering our understanding of forgiveness, but rather it confounds it to insanity.